Hey guys, I'm Saurav, and in this video, let's talk about JPEG versus RAW. Now, JPEG and RAW are basically image file formats, but RAW contains all the details that is captured by your camera sensor, whereas JPEG is basically a compressed form of a RAW file. So think of it as like this. Your camera captures the RAW file, it then tries to process it, and it basically converts it into a JPEG. But in this whole process, the details are compressed. So you have much details in the RAW files when compared to JPEG. Let's see what we are talking about. So this particular file is a RAW file and this one is a JPEG. Now if you see the JPEG file is a bit more saturated. The colors are a bit more saturated in the JPEG as compared to the RAW file, and that's because there's a bit of processing done by the camera. Now let's see the advantages of shooting in RAW. So we'll try to basically boost the shadows and exposure a bit, and we will sync the settings in the JPEG file as well, so that we'll have the same edit. Now let's zoom in the shadows to understand what we are talking about. So if you go back to the JPEG, you will see that the details in the shadows look a bit more clearer in RAW file as compared to a JPEG. Okay, the details in the JPEG are not as good as in RAW. So the details in shadows and highlights are much more better when you are capturing a RAW file. So basically what happens is your camera can capture a huge dynamic range, but you have to process it. And when you're processing a RAW file, you have the flexibility to adjust the highlights and shadows so that you get the look that you want. So when you're capturing a JPEG, you're restricted because you cannot pull the shadows up to a level which you can do it in RAW. Now, this is the same case for highlights. So this particular again is a RAW file. So let's pull the details. So before pulling out the details in the highlights, let's click on this. So you can see there's a bit blown out highlights in the RAW file, but when you see the same JPEG, you have much more blown out highlights. It's the same file, one is a RAW and one is a JPEG file, but JPEG file don't have the same level of details in the highlights as the RAW does. So when we are trying to just decrease the highlights in the RAW, you can see we are getting much more details in the clouds. Now when you do it in the basically JPEG file as well, let's sync the settings again. So when you see the JPEG file, again the colors look more saturated, but let's zoom here. So you can see the details in the JPEG and RAW. So we can see a bit more clouds in the RAW file, but we cannot in the JPEG. So as I was saying before, the details in the highlights and shadows are compressed in the JPEG, and that's why when you're editing the RAW files, you have much more flexibility so that you can use like all the sliders and in Lightroom or any RAW processing software, and you can get the look you want, but you won't get the similar quality when shooting in JPEG. The next advantage is that you can adjust the white balance in RAW files. Now you can do it in the JPEGs too, but let's see what we are talking about. So this particular is a JPEG file and this particular is a RAW file. Now again, it looks a bit more saturated, but the white balance is same on both the cameras, on both the files I mean. So now you have white balance presets here. So when you were shooting, if you had set the white balance to a different setting or the lighting conditions was very difficult, then what you can do later in post-processing, you can adjust the white balance in RAW file and you will have the same level of quality, same colors, which you would if you would have set it in camera. So you have different presets here. So you have daylight, you have again auto, you have cloudy, you have shade. So if you would set these settings on the camera itself, you would have the same colors. So you have that level of flexibility, okay? Like it's good to correct it in camera, but even if you don't, it's not a problem. You can do it later in editing as well. Now, I don't mean that you can't do it in JPEG, but here you don't have those presets as you had while shooting in RAW. So here you can adjust the temperature, here you can adjust the tint to get the same colors. But again, as I said, the level of flexibility that you have in RAW files is far more superior than in JPEG. So even if you are kind of messed up while shooting a particular file, maybe in white balance or exposure, you can always come back home and edit those files and make it look good. And the next advantage is, again, as I said, you have better quality in RAW files. If you want to reduce the noise, if you want to increase the sharpness, if you want to extract the details in highlights and shadows, overall you will have much more better quality in RAW file as compared to JPEG. So if you want better quality, which of course everyone does, you should shoot in RAW if you don't have any issues with editing the RAW files. The next advantage is basically non-destructive editing. Now what I mean by this is, even if you made certain changes in the RAW file and if you try to export it, the original RAW file will still remain kind of unaffected, okay? Even if you export it in JPEG or if in TIFF, the original RAW file will still remain the same. You cannot edit the RAW file and save it as a RAW file. So whatever edits you do, it doesn't matter. You can later come back again and basically try to edit the particular RAW file and the RAW file will be exactly the same as before. Whereas in JPEG, you might save the JPEG and then you can't retrieve the original JPEG. So yeah, when you're shooting in RAW, you have that feature available with you. So the overall conclusion is the RAW file will provide you much more details and much more better quality as compared to JPEG. But as you know, every coin has two sides. Likewise, even RAW has some cons. Let's look upon that. So the very first disadvantage is the file size. So if you compare the file size, so this is one file that's a JPEG. So that's basically 14.6 MB and the same RAW file is about 27.9 MB, so 28 MB of course, right? Approximately. So it's almost double the JPEG size of the RAW file, and that is because the RAW file contains much more details. So if you have memory issues, if you have a memory card that has less storage, or if you're using a machine that cannot handle larger files, then shooting in JPEG is fine. But again, if you want that level of details, if you want that level of quality, you should shoot in RAW. The next disadvantage is that you have to process the RAW files. So if you look, basically let's reset the settings in both the JPEG and RAW file. So if you look in the RAW and JPEG, you will see that the JPEG file looks better straight out of the camera, and that is because it is processed by the camera. So the colors look a bit more lively since they're more saturated. So in order to get a natural look, in order to bring out the colors in the image, you have to process the RAW files. Okay, there are again great softwares like Adobe Lightroom that you are seeing in this video. You have Capture One Pro, you have Camera Raw in Adobe Photoshop as a plugin. So the thing is, you have to kind of edit these RAW files to get a good look. You have to spend time, you have to learn how to edit those RAW files. There's a video on how to edit the RAW files on my channel. The link will be there in the description and popping on the cards also. So you have to spend some time on processing these RAW files, and you have to do it carefully so that you get a good look. I won't say it as a disadvantage because, later in post-processing I can tweak the image, but if you're not comfortable with editing, then JPEG is an option for you. But for me, since I'm very comfortable with editing RAW files, I always prefer shooting in RAW. The next disadvantage is that RAW files are not accessible by most of the devices. So if you want to open the RAW files in some television sets, or you have smartphones, many of the devices don't support RAW files straight out of the camera. Okay, you have to convert it into a JPEG file. So if you want to deliver the file to your clients very quickly, suppose you are in a function, you shoot images and you want to show them, or you want to deliver those images very quickly, then shoot in JPEG, because they won't be able to access RAW files if they don't have the proper software. Okay, so you have to convert that JPEG file. So if you don't have time, then you can shoot in JPEG. But if you have the time of shooting in RAW, if you don't have memory issues and you are comfortable with editing those RAW files, then I don't see that you have any option other than shooting in RAW. Because RAW files, again, when you start editing images, you will understand that once you are shooting RAW and then you convert to JPEG, basically you are losing much more details. So the conclusion is, if you don't have memory issues, if you have the time to process your images, if you're comfortable with processing RAW files, then shoot in RAW. Okay, always shooting in RAW will give you better quality. And if you're shooting images, if you're spending so much time learning photography and trying to capture good images, you want the best quality out of it, right? So if you don't have any of these issues, you should shoot in RAW. So I hope you understood what's the difference between RAW and JPEG and when should you shoot in RAW, when should you shoot in JPEG. Personally, I have time to process these files. I don't have like time issues. I am comfortable with editing RAW files. So I always shoot in RAW. Okay, I never shoot in JPEG, and most of the professionals shoot in RAW because they want the best quality out of the images they are taking. So I hope this video helped you guys, and if it did, press the like button and don't forget to share this video with your friends. I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.